Your brain actually paid you before you even pressed play on this video. The second you decided to put on that show you've already seen 10 times, your nervous system released a hit of dopamine in anticipation. It wasn't rewarding the story itself, but rather the feeling of safety that comes with it. For most people, that's just a quirk of habit. But for you, born between 1965 and 1980, it's a sophisticated psychological survival mechanism you've been refining since you were 6 years old. You aren't stuck in the past or avoiding reality, but instead, you are using a specialized tool for emotional regulation that other generations simply don't have. In the next few minutes, you'll understand the hidden science behind your comfort shows, why your brain treats certain movies like a high-priority identity archive, and the real reason you can't stop rewatching the same endings. It's not nostalgia, it's a sign of how you survived. Saturday morning cartoons weren't just something you watched. They were a weekly appointment your entire nervous system planned around. You woke up before your parents did, not because anyone told you to, or because you had somewhere to be, but because something was on. And if you weren't in front of that TV when it started, you missed it. There was no rewind button, no streaming service, and no YouTube clip waiting for you at midnight. The episode aired once, and while a rerun might surface 6 months later, there was no guarantee. So that was it. Psychologists call this the endowment effect, which is the simple idea that things feel more valuable when they're genuinely hard to get. Because those Saturday morning cartoons were so scarce, your brain registered each episode as something worth protecting and remembering. It filed them differently because the conditions of the time demanded it. But there was a second layer underneath that, and this one is specific to how Gen X women experienced it. When someone asked the Reddit Gen X community to name the most Gen X thing they could think of, over 5,000 people responded. Right near the top, alongside recording songs off the radio onto a cassette tape, was that exact ritual of waking up Saturday morning for cartoons. 5,000 people shared one memory, making it feel like an entire generation had grown up in the very same living room. Psychologists call what happened next communal reinforcement. When other people share an experience with you, your brain doesn't just store it, but instead it stores it as something bigger, more real, and more permanent. Monday morning at school, you weren't talking about the weather, but instead you were talking about what happened on Saturday and whether the plot actually made sense. The show was social currency and a bonding mechanism, acting as a shared language that required no translation because you'd all been watching the same thing at the same time with no algorithm sorting you into separate feeds. For Gen X women specifically, that social layer mattered in a way that went beyond entertainment. The shows gave you something to bring to school and something to compare notes on, which made Monday morning feel like a continuation of Saturday rather than a hard reset. And then there was the sensory side of it, like the specific sound of the VCR rewinding, the smell of cereal in the early morning quiet, and the particular light in the room before anyone else was awake. Those details aren't just nostalgic decoration. They're emotional files your brain attached to those memories and still opens automatically decades later when something triggers even one of them. The TV showed up every week at the same time with a story that began and ended cleanly. And your nervous system noticed that pattern early and filed it away as something safe. More than 90 of the people watching this video right now are not subscribed. If you're starting to realize that your comfort show habit was actually your first act of self-care, then you've found the place where your psychology finally makes sense. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and share this with one person who needs to hear this. Now let's continue. After school, the house was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that felt peaceful. It just felt empty because your parents were still at work and your siblings were off doing their own thing. So you walked through the door and immediately turned on the TV. You didn't do it because you were bored, although that might have been part of it, but because the house needed a sound in it, and that was the only sound that felt right. The afternoon lineup usually consisted of Brady Bunch reruns, Little House on the Prairie, or Happy Days, which were shows that never tried to surprise you or do anything particularly exciting. That was exactly the point of watching them, because every single episode followed the same basic structure where the family hits a problem, someone makes a mistake, and everything is resolved by the final few minutes. Everyone ends up okay, and everything settles back into place, which is something psychologists call cognitive load reduction. When you already know exactly what is going to happen, your brain doesn't have to stay alert or scan for threats while bracing for the next bad thing. You can just be present and comfortable without feeling like you have to stay on guard. And for a kid growing up in a house where adult problems were happening behind closed doors, that mattered more than it should have. Gen X women talk about this in a way that is surprisingly consistent, because the TV wasn't just a distraction from real life. It was the only thing in the room that reliably made sense by starting a problem and finishing it before it ever asked anything of you. This experience is generationally specific because baby boomers grew up with parents who controlled the 3 available channels, and millennials grew up with the internet, pulling their attention in a dozen directions at once. Gen X women landed in a unique window of time where the living room TV belonged entirely to them between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. There was no competition and no one else had an agenda for what you should be watching. So it was just you and whatever happened to be on the screen. Your brain learned something important during those hours by realizing the screen was a reliable presence in a way that other things in your life simply were not. It showed up every day to tell you a complete story with a proper ending. And that connection between the screen turning on and your nervous system settling down got wired into your brain during those formative years. Wiring that is laid down in childhood doesn't just vanish because you grew up and got a mortgage. And the emotional equation your brain built was very straightforward. Screen time equaled safety, and predictability equaled calm, which wasn't a conscious choice you made, but was something that kept getting confirmed every afternoon in a house that needed something dependable. Think about the first time you watched The Breakfast Club, but don't focus on the plot because you already know it by heart. Think about what it actually felt like to watch 5 people who were completely different sit in a library all day and come out the other side knowing each other in a way that felt true. That feeling wasn't just the result of good storytelling, because your brain was doing something very specific with that information and filing it deeper than most of your other experiences. Psychologists call this the Reminiscence Bump, which is the finding that memories formed during your teenage years and early adulthood carry more emotional weight than memories from any other time in your life. Your brain is changing faster during those years than it ever will again as it builds an identity out of whatever materials it can find, so it treats every significant experience as high-priority data. It doesn't just remember these moments, but archives them with full emotional tags attached to every detail. Practically speaking, this means the movies and shows you watched between 12 and 22 aren't stored the same way as your other memories. They are stored as the things that actually shaped who you are, which is why something moves in your chest when you hear the opening notes of Dirty Dancing before your mind even processes the sound. That isn't just sentimentality, but is actually neuroscience at work, because those memories were encoded with more dopamine than the memories you made just last Tuesday. When something unlocks those files, your brain runs the exact same reward pathway it used the first time. And you didn't choose to feel that way because your brain chose for you. This matters specifically for Gen X women because those films were often the first place they saw their own emotional lives reflected back at them with any kind of accuracy. When Steel Magnolias came out in 1989, it did something that almost nothing else was doing by putting 6 women in a room and letting them be complicated, funny, and completely undone by grief. It let them experience all of those things in the same 2 hours without anyone stepping in to resolve the feeling or asking them to pull themselves together. For many women, it was the first time they saw grief handled out loud by women who didn't apologize for it. And that famous scene in the cemetery didn't just make you cry, but gave you permission to. The Breakfast Club did something similar by telling you that you didn't have to pick a single lane for your personality. You could be the responsible person and the one who was falling apart at the same time. Or you could follow the rules while still deeply resenting them. Being multiple things at once wasn't a contradiction, but was just the truth about being a person. And for girls in the 80s who were getting a lot of messages about who they were supposed to be, that film was an answer to a question they hadn't known how to ask. Then Friends and Sex and the City arrived to lock into that same mechanism by adding the idea of a found family. The women who showed up for each other through the boring and ugly parts became a template for what support was supposed to feel like. And many Gen X women measured their real relationships against that standard for years without even realizing they were doing it. Right now, you have access to more television than any human being who has ever lived on this planet. Every show ever made, every film, and every season of every series is available anytime you want on a device that fits right in your pocket. Yet, when you finally sit down to relax, what are you actually watching? It is almost certainly something you have already seen, and you have probably watched it more than once. Most people assume this habit is a little embarrassing or a sign of being stuck in the past. There is a common idea that rewatching familiar content instead of exploring thousands of new options is passive or means you are avoiding your life. The research actually says the opposite is true. Psychologists who study why we return to familiar stories found that the primary goal isn't escape, but rather a need for control. In a world where jobs shift and relationships change shape constantly, your phone likely has 17 notifications before you have even finished your first cup of coffee. Choosing a show where you already know the ending is a deliberate decision to put your nervous system somewhere it can finally breathe. You are not checking out of your life, but instead you are managing your internal state with a tool you have been refining since you were 9 years old, watching reruns in an empty house. This behavior connects directly to cortisol, which is the stress hormone your body produces whenever it feels like it needs to stay on high alert. Familiar content lowers those levels because your brain's internal alarm system finally quiets down when it realizes nothing unexpected is coming. There are no twists you haven't processed and no outcomes you haven't already made peace with. So the result feels like a long, physical exhale. This isn't an accident or a placebo effect, but the exact same neurological mechanism that made afternoon television feel like safety when you were a kid. The wiring in your brain is identical, only now it has 40 years of reinforcement behind it. The shows Gen X women gravitate toward as adults usually split into two very distinct streams. First, there is the complex and morally serious television like Yellowstone, Succession, or The Sopranos, which are stories about power and the real cost of the choices people make. Nobody in these shows is simply good or simply bad, and that is exactly how the world looks once you are 50 and have been paying attention. These shows do not offer you comfort, but they do offer recognition by holding a mirror up to the world as you actually know it. Running alongside those heavy dramas are the comfort rewatches that provide a different kind of support. Between 2021 and 2025, Grey's Anatomy accumulated 3.5 billion streaming hours, and Gen X women make up a massive part of that number. Going back to a show like that isn't just soft nostalgia, but what psychologists call self-continuity, which is the act of using familiar stories to maintain a coherent sense of who you are. When you return to a show you watched during a specific period of your life, you are locating yourself and checking in with a version of you that still exists in your mental filing system. The nostalgia Gen X women carry has naturally gotten sharper over the years. It comes with new questions about what those stories meant and what they quietly got wrong about the world. That isn't a sign of disillusionment, but rather what it looks like when an entire generation has been paying close attention for a very long time. Your comfort show habit isn't a sign of being stuck, but rather evidence of how long you have known how to take care of yourself. You didn't just survive your childhood, you actually built a sophisticated psychological toolkit that you are still using to navigate your life today. More than 50% of people have already clicked away by now. But because you are still here, you are clearly looking for the deeper truth behind your own behavior. That level of self-awareness is exactly why this information finally clicked for you. If you are ready to see how this same survival mechanism is currently shaping your relationships, the next video is where the real work begins.